All right, all right. Everyone, sit down. Let's get situated. How was everyone's break? Anyone do anything interesting? No. Well, I spent the past few weeks listening to The Girl From Ipanema on loop while running up and down a flight of stairs to try to get in the mind of the guy who invented the elevator. Is there like a diagnosis for that or some sort of pill I can take? Who invented the elevator anyway? Alright, let's see here. Who invented the elevator? Huh. Elisha Otis. Wait, he died in Yonkers, New York? What the hell is a Yonkers? Alright, well, until they start making that movie about elevators everyone's been talking about, I guess I'll stick to my day job and we'll talk about a poem that most people hate today. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. If you've ever been to high school in America, you were probably just yelling stop at your screens, but I must have put you all on mute or something because I didn't hear anything. This poem is pretty universal, even outside of the USA to an extent, and it's very much hated because of that. It has been notorious for being overinterpreted and just beaten to death. You know, we have heard everything you can possibly hear about this poem. It's been interpreted every which way possible. No one wants to hear about it. You hear groans and moans anytime its name is even brought up. Even I didn't like this poem when I first heard it. To be fair, when you're a teenager and you can barely wake up in time to even get to class to begin with, and then someone sits you down and tells you you have to interpret these weirdly rhymed, weirdly phrased lines by some old guy I've never even heard of, like, yeah, you're not going to be into it. You're not going to pay a lot of attention. I certainly didn't. And it took me a long time to realize that that was just my sleep-deprived brain being grumpy. It did take me around 6 years to get more than 4 hours of sleep at a time, but I finally did. And it turns out that some of these poems are actually good and worth reading, unfortunately. If you're going to be stuck here in this world where so much poetry has been written, why not at least try to see if you like it, you know? We might as well give it a shot. To be fair to all the English teachers out there, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost is a pretty smart choice if you're going to force a bunch of teenagers to sit around and talk about a poem. It's, long enough that you can fill about an hour of time talking about it, but not so long that you're going to be exhausted by the end of it. It's not going to take you a whole week or like a whole semester to discuss. So it's got a lot of the basic traditions of poetry in there. You can talk about a lot of elements of a poem, but it is subversive enough at some times that it's not like clinical. Like it does break a few technical rules of like meter and foots. There's a lot of substitutions and things in it that give it a bit more of a fun feeling almost, if you can call poetry fun. I apparently do. I didn't expect to say that word about this poem, but here we are. And also, very importantly, it is old enough that we can admit that it's a classic at this point, but not so old that I'm having to translate it from English into an English we can actually read. That's probably the most important thing about this, is that it has that classic status, but it's also very readable to a modern audience. And that's something that can scare a lot of people off. When I feel like my only exposure to a poem is this thing that takes like a separate dictionary just to fully understand, I'm not going to go looking out for poetry in my free time. It's just not going to happen. And so I think it's very smart to introduce something that you can just read out the gate and get a good grasp on. But that's also sort of where it starts to become a problem. Because there is a paradox in a classic, which is that after a few generations of something entering the canon or becoming considered a classic, it sort of precedes itself. Its reputation means that you're just not going to give it the same attention you'd give something that you aren't as certain about. So, for instance, if you read just a random contemporary poem on your very own, you have no baggage associated with it. You come into it with no preconceived idea of whether it's good or bad or what it might mean. And so you have to read and pay attention and figure that out for yourself. But if you're handed something and told, this is a very good poem that means this, and you either disagree that it's not very good or you don't understand how someone got to that point of what it means, you're just going to assume this thing isn't for you. And that's the problem with classics, is that if you read the wrong classic, if something's just not for you, it can give you the impression that this medium isn't for you. And that's not something I want for you guys. I want us all to be able to just enjoy a good poem and not have to worry about it. And so we're going to start where all of your wounds began, with the poem that made so many of us decide that poetry was just about hitting enter randomly in a sentence and then way reading into it, just to the point where it's not fun for anyone anymore. Now, I don't want to give the impression that contemporary poetry is bad in any way. I'm not one of those people that thinks that poetry stopped being good by like the Great Depression or something like that. Contemporary poetry is very great. I think there are a lot of great contemporary poets out there, but it's a bad place to start because until it gets some sort of classic status, it is difficult to decide what we can all agree has the elements of a good poem. You know, it's not completely objective what makes a poem good, but if something has been, you know, held in the canon for multiple generations, we can at least agree that a lot of people think it's good. And a lot of people agree that that's a good way to decide what does and doesn't have some sort of quality to it. I will admit that this poem is in this class because it's in every class. We're talking about this because I'm pretty sure you've heard it before, and I want to give you a new perspective on it. I don't want you to feel like this is some random poem I'm pulling out of thin air that I just personally like. I want to pick something and try to see if we can all come to understand why we got to this point to begin with. A classic can create some sort of feedback loop if you're not careful. Any small amount of static or misreading of this poem can turn into just an exponentially large misunderstanding because, again, people aren't necessarily reading the poem, they're just going through it trying to find what they're told is already there. And so that can cause problems. And that's actually what we're here to talk about today. Because a lot of what I've heard about this poem, when I was younger at least, is not necessarily wrong, but inaccurate in the way that only that static can create. This poem is famous for being about taking risks and forging your own path in life. It's considered a very American poem in that way, being about freedom and independence. It's been considered probably one of the most popular American poems ever because it's so identified with this American tradition of being all about freedom and all the things that make us a complete pain in the ass. If you read the full poem in context, that's definitely there, but it's a misreading of it. It's a misunderstanding of why it's there in the first place, I think. Even if you think all these things, you at least know one person in your life who does think that this poem is about, you know, not following your crowd, following the beat of your own drum, that sort of thing. So how did we get there? How did that one little piece of static just completely blow up into this whole thing? I think that it's because there is a kernel of truth in there. Like, this is about some of those things, but the poem is more than that. And so we need to discuss that as well. There's a lot of discourse around this poem, especially lately, but I'm not interested in that. If you're here to see me dunk on people for getting this poem wrong, you're in the wrong place. I only have a Twitter account because when I went to delete it, there was this weird like black X where the Twitter used to be, and I see that as like a really bad omen of terrible things to come, so I just haven't touched it or looked at it since. Sometimes I'm non-committal on purpose, and I'll undercut myself for the sake of like a joke or something, but I really am torn this time around. I know that there are two sides to this discourse, and I don't want to take one particular side. You know, on the one hand, there is an urge in me to go the classic route of, oh, this poem isn't about that at all. You've completely misread it. Here's what it actually is about and why it's actually about that. Here's all of the evidence in the poem to show that what you think it's about is completely wrong. But that's what scared me off of poetry in the first place, was this sense that if you're not completely paying full attention to every little minute detail, then you've completely missed the whole thing and you're just a dumb idiot. That's not fun for anyone, and it just, I guess, feeds the egos of elite poetry readers, and they can just sit there and laugh at everyone else as the medium they love crumbles around them. But I don't want that. I want you to actually like poetry by the end of this. I want us to be able to just sit and read a nice poem together. You just come to the office hours and read a poem to me, and I'll sit there and listen to it, I guess. I've got nothing else to do. No one comes to my office hours. The scary approach isn't fun for me. I don't want to be that guy who tells you that you're wrong about something just because I can, because I don't think you're wrong about it. The other side, of course, is to admit that there is a reason why so many people think the poem is about like freedom and independence, and to discuss where that kernel of truth came from and how that little bit of static completely evolved into what we talk about with this poem today. The whole point of picking this poem was to make poetry not scary by dealing with something we've all dealt with before, and most of us probably didn't fully understand or like. And if we're going to discuss this poem legitimately, we can't pick a side before we even start. So what I want to do is discuss how I read this poem and how I got to the point of what I believe it means today, and then leave it to you to decide what you think the poem means for yourself. Because let's be honest, both points do have their merits, and I don't think either one is completely right or completely wrong. So I'm going to do something for you. I'm going to present you with two roads, the road not taken and the road most taken. Now, the road not taken will show you the context and original history of this poem and why so many people have started to take this contrarian stance that the poem doesn't exactly mean what so many people say it does. If you choose to take the road most taken, though, then we'll discuss where that kernel of truth came from and maybe how some of that static got us to this point in the first place, and how we can, with a little bit of adjustment, come to a better and more comprehensive understanding of what the poem means. Whatever road you choose to take is yours to decide, but yes, I did steal this choose your own adventure bit from Markiplier. If you want to see what like an actual professional looks like doing this, then there will be links in the description and you can go watch that instead. I won't force you to follow me down either of these roads. But without further ado, let's go take a walk. In the spirit of way leading on to way, I will ask that you choose a road and stick with it. When you've finished that road, go on to whatever is next. Please don't return here to see what waits down the other path. I can't force you to do this, but I can promise you that completion isn't everything. Sometimes the mystery of what waited down the other road is part of what makes the one you choose special. Now let's travel a road together. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth.